So today we're going to be speaking about frontier Islam in medieval Anatolia. Medieval Anatolia is that part of the world in which the Ottomans came out of. But when we speak about a frontier, what are we actually speaking about? So frontiers are places in which the political boundaries of a group, a nation, a polity, a religion are expanding or contracting. So this purple map, you can see in the purple part of the map, the kind of classical spaces that became the Islamic world after the initial Arab conquest that started in Mecca and Medina in around the year 630 and quickly conquered North Africa, Syria, Iran, and Central Asia. But afterwards, there were still frontiers, most notably on Anatolian world, parts of Northwest Africa and northern India. And that part of Anatolia is going to be the space from which the Ottomans ended up growing. At the same time, there were other frontiers, places where Muslims actually did not expand to, but actually contracted from, such as Spain and parts of Russia eventually, that we can tell a different story, but had similar frontier dynamics at the same time as Anatolia or northern India or Bengal, for example. Now, again, the frontier is important because it's a space of different political and religious dynamics. And this space in this cultural world is where the Ottomans, the dynasty that ends up ruling the Middle East for over 600 years, emerges from. So if we look at Anatolia in the 1300s, what we find is a whole bunch of different Turkish emirates. Beyliks is another word for them. Basically, tribal groupings that are controlling territory and conducting raids. And there's a whole variety of them, right? There's the Karasi, Osman, Umarhan, Candorolu, Janik, etc. There's Ilkhan empires, the Mongols. And what you get is essentially a lot of different competition as these different Turkish groups are pushed against the Byzantine Empire and its frontier in Anatolia. And really Osman, that is the Ottomans, are the ones that are emerging here. At this point, very small, but eventually going to be bigger. So that's the literal frontier. But on the frontier, there's also different types of Islamic life. And this is really a space in which the population, in which the rulership is changing from a Christian Byzantine world to one centered on a Turkic-speaking Islamic world. But to understand what that change implies, we have to understand different forms of Islam. And so this is what I want to talk about kind of just in this section, Islam of the city versus Islam of the frontier. So if we think of the city, we might think of a space centered on specific institutions, like built institutions, places like the mosque, which is probably the one institution you think of when you think of Islam, right? Mosque, church, synagogue, somehow like that. But this was really not found very commonly in many Anatolian cities, or especially in the countryside, but even in cities it wasn't that common. And when you do find them, they were basically in large places like Sivas or Konya or other centers of urban life. And it's there that you find the traditional kind of Muslim culture elites, what are called ulema, kind of scholars. But we're talking about people like judges and prayer leaders, etc. People who would be educated in something called Sharia, that is the law. Just another word for the law. It literally means the way. And so through like places like mosques and places where they studied the law, like madrasas, they instituted a particular form of Islam, the one that's actually quite similar to what we know today. Now, this also included Sufis, and as we'll see, one of the paradigmatic kind of urban city Sufis was Jalaluddin ar-Rumi, who we talked about in other lectures. Well, at the same time, it was also being supported by artisans, often Persian-speaking artisans. And really, if we look at the urban population here, a lot of it is Iranian migrants, Persian-speaking migrants coming from Iran, settling in these places, working as bricklayers and woodworkers and ceramicists and other things, and joining Sufi orders there. And so what we have is a dynamic in which the cities, people would speak Persian. When they wanted to speak about law or science or religion, they would use Arabic. But in the countryside, on the frontier, it was a Turkish-speaking world. Now, let's just look very quickly at one paradigmatic city Sufi, and that's Jalaluddin Rumi. He himself is an Iranian migrant, even though his name, Jalaluddin, means kind of the sublimity of the religion, but Rumi means someone from the land of Rum. In this case, he settled in Konya after moving to Iran in the land of Rum, in this place called Konya, and he was very close to the Seljuk government. The Seljuks were the dynasty that controlled central Anatolia in the 1200s. And in fact, when he died, they built this impressive tomb in this kind of Central Asian, Iranian, Timurid style, which you can still see today in the middle of Konya. It's really at the center of it. And when you look at him, for example, depicted in this later illustration, what you see here is someone who's on a horse, riding with great luxury, etc., followed by various dignitaries. But you also see these figures, especially this guy in the bottom left corner. Keep an eye on him because we're going to get back to him when we talk about antinomianism. So he's a city Sufi. He's a city kind of Muslim in a sense. He's close to the government, has ties to the artisanal groups, but doesn't have ties to the Turkic-speaking frontier lords that we'll see. Instead, the frontier lords often preferred to patronize and partake in what we can call frontier Islam. Now, this, unlike the city Islam, was not conducted in Persian. It was mostly in Turkish. And in fact, at this point, Turkish is not a written language, really. There's beginnings of poems. There is a few pieces here and there, but we're not talking about a grand literary tradition. And in fact, often these very people, whether the holy men or the frontier lords themselves, are dismissive of the sort of legal learning or theological learning that the ulama, the scholars and the judges and the learned elites had in cities. Instead of focusing on mosques and madrasas and legal scholars, what they focused on instead were saints and holy men. Those guys were, all of these saints and holy men were part of the world of Sufism, but they were these frontier ones were distinct from that of the city Sufis, people like Jalaluddin Rumi. Instead, they moved with the countryside people. They moved with the frontier warlords, and they set up, instead of mosques and madrasas, they set up lodges and shrines. Okay, we're going to look at some of those now in the course. Here's an example of one of them, one whose tomb you can still see today. His name is Geyikli Baba. Geyik is a stag, basically. So, a large deer with a lot of antlers. And if you translate his name, basically it literally means just like stag daddy. And he was a Turkoman sheikh, right? So he's a nomadic Turk who marched with the Ottoman armies. He actually helped them take over Bursa, and was fighting with them on the frontier while kind of also having spiritual authority here. And if you were to go to his tomb today, you could still find antlers hung over his grave. One of the other interesting things is that if you go outside of it, you'll also find a very large chinar or plane tree. And in fact, if you go to many of these medieval shrines and lodges, there will be a very large tree right close by. And this was also, I think, a key part of the shrine ecology. So let's just stop there for now and continue in a second.